Aloha. Welcome to Light Drama Action. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe. And let's get to the content for today. Peace.
Before we begin, I want to offer a clear and firm warning. What you are about to hear contains graphic descriptions as detailed in open court during the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs. These are not dramatizations, but actual testimony given under oath. This content is intended for mature audiences only. And remember, all individuals mentioned in this video, including Mr. Combs, are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. If you're joining us for the first time, full summaries for days 1 through 14 are available on the video tab of this channel. Day 15, witnesses Derek Ferguson and Eddy Garcia unravel secrets in Diddy's federal trial. Derek Ferguson, the former chief financial officer of Sean Diddy Combs' Bad Boy Entertainment and later an executive at Combs' Revolt TV, and Eddy Garcia, a former InterContinental Hotel security officer, each took the stand on day 15 of Combs' high-profile federal trial. Both men from starkly different corners of Combs' world brought crucial testimony that combined to paint a dramatic, at times contradictory, portrait of the music mogul at the center of a sprawling case. Combs is facing an array of grave charges, including sex trafficking, racketeering conspiracy, forced labor, and transporting individuals across state lines for prostitution, and he has pleaded not guilty to all counts. Prosecutors allege that for over a decade, Combs ran a criminal enterprise leveraging his entertainment businesses and personal entourage to commit heinous abuses, physical assaults, coerced sexual encounters, hush money payoffs, and intimidation. If convicted on the top counts, the 53-year-old hip-hop icon could spend the rest of his life in prison. The defense, however, maintains that Combs' empire was a legitimate business and that any dark allegations, from lurid freak-off sex parties to violent outbursts, either never occurred or were the acts of a man in his private life, not part of any organized scheme. It is against this backdrop of dueling narratives that Ferguson and Garcia's testimonies landed with dramatic force. The courtroom on Tuesday morning hummed with tension and anticipation. Spectators filled the gallery benches, a mixture of press with badges dangling from necks, curious members of the public, and a few recognizable faces from Combs' circle. In the front row, Combs' mother Janice watched intently behind designer sunglasses, her presence a constant throughout the trial. On this day, she arrived clad in gold hoop earrings and a chic striped blouse beneath a sequined black jacket, a glamorous pillar of support for her son. Combs' eldest son, Justin, also slipped quietly into the courtroom wearing a crisp striped shirt and black tie, accompanied by a family friend sporting a bold free puff hoodie, a not-so-subtle show of loyalty to the man on trial. Even amid these loyalists, an undercurrent of uncertainty crackled in the air. After 2 prior weeks packed with shocking testimony from accusers, including Combs' former girlfriend Cassie Ventura, everyone knew day 15 promised more revelations. At the defense table, Sean Diddy Combs cut a distinctive figure, donning a sleek copper-toned sweater over a white-collared shirt. The outfit caught the light as he entered, a flash of personality in an otherwise sober setting. As is his habit, Combs paused to hug each member of his defense team before taking his seat, a forced smile flickering across his face. Despite the outward cordiality, his eyes betrayed strain, unsurprising given the stakes. Still, he attempted a confident front. He spent the early minutes before the judge entered animatedly conferring with one of his attorneys, Xavier Donaldson, leaning in close and gesturing as they discussed documents. This was a notable departure from Combs' typically calm, almost stone-faced courtroom demeanor. Throughout the trial thus far, he has largely sat through testimony with a studied, stony composure, hands folded, expression neutral, as accusers detailed alleged abuses. But this morning, that calm was punctured, hinting at the high drama to come. Arrayed around Combs was his phalanx of high-powered defense lawyers, each with a distinct style. At the helm was Mark Agnifilo, lead counsel, known for his genteel but unyielding approach. A seasoned trial attorney with silvering hair and an impeccable three-piece suit, Agnifilo projected an air of polite confidence. He often speaks softly and formally, yet his pointed questions can land like punches. Beside him sat Brian Steele, a later addition to the team famous for his work in another headline-grabbing racketeering trial. Steele's presence lent a sharper edge. With his intense gaze and rapid-fire southern drawl, he had become the most vocal defense attorney in recent days, especially during cross-examinations. Also present was Tenny Garagos, a younger attorney whose sharp features and focused frown telegraphed determination. She had sparred with prosecutors over the admissibility of certain evidence, notably decrying a key video of Combs assaulting Cassie as unduly prejudicial. Rounding out the team was Nicole Westmoreland, who observed quietly for much of the day, occasionally leaning in to whisper strategy. Westmoreland had only stepped forward once earlier in the trial to cross-examine a minor witness, but her attentive eyes never left the action. Together, the defense attorneys formed a wall of reassurance around Combs, even as they shuffled papers and tapped on laptops, projecting an image of meticulous control. Opposite them at the prosecution table sat the government's lawyers. Maureen Comey, an assistant U.S. attorney with a composed demeanor, led much of the questioning. Comey, her brown hair pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail, is known for her calm but relentless style, surgically exposing inconsistencies in defense arguments. At her side was Christy Slavic, another federal prosecutor who speaks with crisp precision. Slavic often handles follow-up questions and rebuttals. Her tone is firm and direct, the kind that brooks no nonsense. Both women wore tailored navy suits and bore the confident posture of those who have spent months building a case brick by brick. Occasionally, they consulted with a third prosecutor at the table or flipped through thick binders of evidence. On their faces, a look of controlled intensity, as if fully aware that every witness today could make or break their far-reaching case alleging Combs was the orchestrator of a criminal enterprise. At the center of it all was Judge Arun Subramanian, presiding with a steady hand. Judge Subramanian, a man in his 40s with a thoughtful expression, surveyed the courtroom from the bench with alert, dark eyes. He wore his black robes lightly, often leaning forward with hands clasped as he listened, but there was no mistaking his authority. By this fourth week of trial, the judge had shown little patience for sideshows or delays. He kept proceedings moving briskly and enforced courtroom rules strictly, including a protective order granting certain witnesses anonymity for their safety. Under his guidance, the trial had maintained a tense but orderly cadence until that order was unexpectedly tested this morning. Morning fireworks, a disturbance, and the judge's stern warning. Day 15 began not with testimony, but with an uproar that jolted the courtroom and momentarily shifted the focus from the witness stand to the gallery. Just after 9 a.m., as lawyers and spectators settled in, prosecutors raised an urgent issue. Someone had violated the court's pseudonym order protecting one of Combs' accusers. In measured tones, Assistant U.S. Attorney Comey informed Judge Subramanian that a media outlet, and perhaps an individual present in the courthouse the previous day, had publicly revealed the real name of Mia, a former Combs assistant who had testified under pseudonym for privacy. The atmosphere, already anxious, tightened further as Comey explained that this breach of anonymity had potentially endangered the witness. Judge Subramanian's brow furrowed at the news. He had issued strict instructions that Mia's identity remain sealed, given the sensitive nature of her testimony. Mia had testified behind closed doors and under an alias to being and by Combs during her employment, explosive allegations that underscored the sex trafficking charge. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line as he considered remedies. He was clearly prepared to take action, likely instructing U.S. Marshals to locate and eject any culprit in the building and ordering the media outlet to retract the identifying post. Suddenly, before Judge Subramanian could respond, chaos erupted. A woman's voice rang out from the middle of the public seating area, loud and furious. "Diddy! Are laughing at you," she shouted, slicing through the quiet formality of the court. All heads whipped toward the outburst. For a split second, stunned silence followed. The phrase hung in the air, vulgar and shocking in this hall of justice. The woman, defying courtroom decorum entirely, continued her tirade even as court security officers converged on her. "They're laughing at a black man's legacy," she yelled, her face twisted with rage and desperation. And then, bizarrely, she taunted, "Pull your gun out, I dare you." A challenge hurled either at the approaching guards or perhaps at anyone she perceived as a threat to Combs. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the spectators. Jurors' eyes went wide. A few leaned away as if to avoid the blast of emotion. At the defense table, Combs himself remained seated, spine stiff, jaw clenched, as the commotion unfolded behind him. Only a muscle in his cheek twitched, betraying tension. His lawyers immediately stood in objection to the disruption, concern flashing across their faces that jurors might be rattled or influenced by the unsolicited theatrics. Across the room, Prosecutor Comey froze mid-sentence, a frown of displeasure on her face. Within seconds, the courtroom deputies and U.S. Marshals sprang into action. Two officers flanked the woman, who was still railing about people coming for Diddy. They lifted her firmly by the arms. Judge Subramanian, eyes blazing now, pointed sharply toward the door and spoke in a voice that cut through the chaos. "Remove her from the courtroom immediately." The command needed no repetition. In a flurry of movement, the heckler, a petite, middle-aged woman with a shock of curly hair, was swiftly subdued and hustled up the aisle, her protest trailing off into the corridor. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind the entourage of marshals escorting her out. As the dust settled, a heavy silence fell. The judge's gaze swept the room, ensuring no further disturbance. "So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Subramanian said evenly, "please disregard that interruption." He then addressed the rest of the courtroom with an unmistakable edge in his voice. Without naming the ejected spectator, he reminded everyone that outbursts or attempts to influence the proceedings would not be tolerated. The judge's normally calm demeanor had given way to stern authority. It was evident that he viewed this incident as a serious breach of decorum. He then pivoted back to the matter of Mia's compromised anonymity. In measured words, Judge Subramanian promised to reinforce the rules both in the main courtroom and the overflow rooms where media and public watched via video feed. He made it clear that any person who violated the court's protective orders, whether by shouting in court or by posting identifying information online, would face consequences. By now, the jurors had collected themselves, though a few shot uneasy glances toward the gallery. The judge offered a brief reassurance that the trial would remain focused on evidence and testimony alone. In the front row, Combs' mother gently exhaled, adjusting her glasses. On the witness stand, empty during this disruption, a glass of water trembled slightly, the only remaining sign of the shock that had just coursed through the room. After a short pause to ensure everyone regained composure, the proceedings resumed. The jury's attention refocused on the front of the room, where the first witness of the day was about to be called. A sense of anticipation rebuilt itself. The disturbance was over, but a charged energy lingered, as if everyone understood that what came next could be even more consequential. Eddy, my angel, Eddy Garcia's explosive testimony. Once the courtroom was calm, the prosecution called Eddy Garcia to the stand. Garcia, a 31-year-old former security supervisor at the InterContinental Hotel in Los Angeles, walked forward slowly, every eye tracking his movements. He was of medium build but solid, with broad shoulders that filled out his gray blazer. As he took the oath and sat, he adjusted his tie nervously. Garcia's face was slightly pale under the courtroom lights. One could see a sheen of sweat at his temple. He had the look of a man carrying a heavy secret. And indeed he was one he had kept buried for years until law enforcement came knocking. The prosecutor's voices took on a hushed, deliberate tone as they began questioning him, almost as if they were aware of the bombshells his testimony was about to drop. Garcia introduced himself and confirmed his background. In March 2016, he was a low-level security officer at the upscale InterContinental in Los Angeles, earning just $10.50 an hour checking IDs and monitoring cameras. That job would put him at the epicenter of a now infamous incident, an incident caught on surveillance video that had since become one of the prosecution's most potent pieces of evidence against Sean Combs. The jurors leaned forward as Garcia recounted the basics. On the night of March 5th, 2016, Sean Combs and his then girlfriend Cassie Ventura were guests at the hotel. In the early morning hours, an emergency call came through, a domestic disturbance in one of the hallways. Garcia responded and soon witnessed a scene of startling violence. Combs, clad only in a towel, was kicking, stomping, and dragging Cassie Ventura in the corridor outside their suite. This was not the first time the jury had heard of the 2016 hotel assault. They had even seen portions of the video early in the trial during opening statements, but hearing from a man who was there in person lent the moment grave weight. Garcia's eyes flicked over to the defendant for a moment when he described the footage. Combs sat rigidly at the defense table, expression unreadable, his gaze aimed at some fixed point on the wood grain. One of Combs' attorneys subtly tapped a pencil, a nervous tick underscoring the tension as the ugly details resurfaced. The prosecutor, Christy Slavic, asked Garcia to describe exactly what he did after witnessing the assault. Garcia's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I made sure Ms. Ventura was safe," he said. He and another guard, Israel Flores, intervened. Enough to separate Combs from Cassie perhaps, but not daring to physically confront the powerful celebrity. Cassie was shaken and bruised, but she declined to involve the police. In that heated moment, Garcia helped escort her back to her room once Combs had stormed off. That could have been the end of Garcia's involvement. Just another night where a luxury hotel security quietly handled a celebrity dust-up. But what happened over the next 48 hours would change the trajectory of Garcia's life and become a focal point of the federal case. Garcia proceeded to testify about a secret deal struck in the aftermath of the assault, a deal to make the video footage disappear. As he began this part of the story, his voice tightened and he licked his lips, clearly anxious. Prosecutor Slavic's questions were gentle but pointed, drawing out each step. In the hours after the incident, Combs' team sprang into damage control mode. Garcia recalled that later on the very day of the assault, he received a phone call from a woman named Christina Courtroom, Combs' chief of staff. Courtroom's tone was urgent yet trying to stay friendly. "She asked me if there was any way she could get a copy of the surveillance footage or at least see it," Garcia testified. Sitting on the stand, Garcia clenched his hands together as he recounted his answer. "No," he told her. Hotel policy was strict. Security footage couldn't be viewed or given out to anyone outside security management. "I said I couldn't help her," Garcia affirmed. A few hours later, Courtroom actually showed up in the hotel lobby in person, pressing again. Garcia refused once more, nervously aware how valuable and dangerous that footage was. By evening, things escalated. Garcia's phone rang again. This time, Courtroom was patching Sean Combs himself onto the call. The courtroom was pin-drop silent as Garcia described hearing the distinctive voice of Diddy on the line. Combs sounded anxious, almost desperate. "He told me," Garcia said, pausing to mimic the apologetic tone, "that he'd had too much to drink that night. He said if that video got out, it would ruin his career." Jurors watched Garcia intently. A few raised their eyebrows. It was a surreal image. A world-famous artist personally calling a security guard who made barely $10 an hour, begging him to keep a violent mistake under wraps. Garcia admitted he felt torn. On one hand, he had a job and principles. On the other, the most powerful man he'd ever encountered was pleading for his help. "I told Mr. Combs I couldn't get the video," Garcia explained, and truthfully, he didn't even have clearance to pull footage from the secure server room. Only his supervisor could. That seemed to momentarily stall Combs, but a short while later, Garcia got yet another call from Diddy and Courtroom. This time, Combs cut straight to the chase. He offered to take care of Garcia, an unmistakable hint at a payoff. At those words, Garcia's stomach lurched. As he recounted in court, he understood that to mean financially. The witness's voice dropped to almost a whisper as he admitted this, as though still embarrassed at being seduced by the lure of a rich man's money. Knowing he couldn't do this alone, Garcia said he then contacted his direct supervisor, the hotel's head of security. The supervisor, upon hearing that Combs was willing to pay, agreed they could sell the footage for $50,000. This was a staggering sum to Garcia, who at the time struggled to pay bills. The plan came together quickly. The supervisor retrieved the relevant video file from the server and loaded it onto a USB drive. The next day, March 6th, Garcia was tasked with executing the handoff. The jury listened, rapt, as he described how it unfolded like a clandestine spy exchange. Garcia arranged to meet Combs in person at a private location in Los Angeles the day after the assault. He drove to an address provided over the phone, some upscale property where he said Combs was waiting with Christina Courtroom and a burly personal bodyguard. In a small conference room on site, Garcia came face to face with Sean Combs. It was a moment he'd never forget. The superstar, who had been a larger-than-life figure on TV and in music, was now directly looking to him for help, calling him by name. Garcia was keenly aware of the power dynamic. "I was nervous around him," he testified, and one could see his hands tighten on the wooden sides of the witness stand at the recollection. He was about to sell evidence of a possible crime back to the man accused of it, a risky, potentially illegal favor. And if anything went wrong, Garcia feared he could be implicated. He mustered the courage to voice one concern to Combs. What if Cassie Ventura decided to file a police report about the assault? If law enforcement came asking for the video, Garcia worried he'd get in serious trouble for making it vanish. Hearing this, Combs acted fast to allay Garcia's fears. According to Garcia's testimony, Combs pulled out his smartphone and made a video call. It was Cassie on the other end, presumably via FaceTime. Combs then handed the phone to Garcia so he could see and hear Cassie directly. The courtroom held its collective breath as Garcia described that moment. Cassie's beautiful face appeared on the small screen, looking tense and upset. Combs prompted her, essentially coaching her on what to say. Garcia recounted Combs telling Cassie, "Let him know that you want the video to go away too." And Cassie complied. In a quiet voice, she told Garcia that she had a movie coming out soon. Indeed, in 2016, Cassie was dabbling in acting and that it wasn't a good time for this to come out. She said she wanted the video to go away. Several jurors exchanged glances at this revelation. Hearing that Cassie herself had effectively conspired in covering up her own assault, at least at that time, it was a startling twist. Ventura, who later became one of Combs' primary accusers, had once been complicit in bearing evidence, likely out of fear or manipulation. In the courtroom, an uneasy realization set in that this saga was not black and white. Even a victim had been drawn into the secrecy under duress. One could practically feel the emotional complexity. Cassie's words on that phone call were probably born of humiliation and intimidation. Still, the defense team took note. One attorney scribbled furiously, perhaps planning to later argue that Cassie's compliance meant the incident was being overblown. With Cassie's reassurance, Garcia felt more at ease proceeding. There, in that quiet meeting room, he handed Sean Combs the USB drive containing the only known copy of the hallway surveillance footage. But Combs wasn't about to simply trust a handover. He had paperwork prepared. Garcia testified that before any money exchanged hands, he was asked to sign documents. Prosecutors produced copies of these contracts and projected them on the courtroom screen as Garcia explained their contents. One was a formal declaration stating that Garcia had indeed delivered the only existing copy of the video and that no other duplicates remained on hotel servers or elsewhere. Another was a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, a dense legal document forbidding Garcia from ever speaking of this transaction or the events it concerned. The NDA, it turned out, was remarkably strict. It included a clause that if Garcia ever breached confidentiality, he would owe Combs $1 million in liquidated damages. He didn't read all the fine print in that hurried moment. He was given no time to consult a lawyer, and frankly, he was too anxious to protest. He just signed where he was told to sign, acutely aware that he was signing away both the video and his silence. Once the paperwork was done, Garcia said, Combs stepped out of the room briefly. When Combs returned, he was carrying something unexpected, a portable money counting machine in a bulky brown paper bag. At this detail, a ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Garcia's voice picked up a bit of momentum as he described it. Combs set the device on the table and began feeding stacks of cash into it, the machine's digital display climbing by $1,000 increments. He was counting out 10,000 at a time, Garcia said. Combs was completely absorbed in the task, watching the machine tally up 10,000, 20,000, 50. He didn't stop until it reached $100,000. Then Combs pulled out the neatly banded bricks of bills and stuffed them back into the crinkled brown bag, which he promptly handed to Garcia. There was a collective inhalation among the jurors. Even the judge raised his eyebrows subtly at the brazenness of the act being described. $100,000 in cash, delivered like a gangster payoff in a movie, all to make a damning video vanish, it was the very picture of an illicit cover-up. In the audience, a few of Combs' supporters shifted uncomfortably, the enormity of that sum not lost on anyone. Garcia's hands trembled slightly as he mimed receiving the bag. He recalled peeking inside and seeing stacks of $100 bills. Before he could even speak, Combs offered a word of caution. Don't make any big purchases with it. This warning was striking. It implied Combs knew the money could draw attention if spent lavishly. Perhaps he feared a large deposit or flashy buy might tip off authorities. To Garcia, the message was clear. Take this money, keep quiet, and stay invisible. The prosecutor's voice was low, almost somber, as she asked what Garcia did with the cash. Garcia explained that the $100,000 was actually double the agreed price. He understood that Combs was paying extra to ensure loyalty. The initial deal was $50,000 for the video, but Combs had doubled it on the spot to sweeten the pot. As instructed by his boss, Garcia did not keep it all. In fact, he split it 3 ways. $50,000 went to his security supervisor, the one who authorized selling out the footage in the first place. $20,000 went to another guard who had been involved in responding that night, likely the same Israel Flores who had also witnessed Combs' violence, and Garcia kept $30,000 for himself. With my share, I bought a used car, Garcia testified quietly, a touch of ruefulness in his tone, as if even he found it a meager, ignoble reward for participating in a cover-up. The picture of him taking home $30,000 after earning minimum wage pay was another study in contrast, a huge windfall at the cost of his conscience. Before Garcia stepped down from the stand, prosecutors elicited one more crucial part of his story: the aftermath and his eventual cooperation with law enforcement. For years after that 2016 incident, Garcia kept the secret. He honored the NDA out of fear of the $1 million penalty, or perhaps fear of Combs' reach, and lied when asked about it. In fact, Garcia admitted that when FBI agents and federal prosecutors first approached him in 2024 during their investigation, he was not truthful. I didn't tell them what really happened, not at first, he confessed, looking down at his hands. His voice tightened with shame. He had perjured himself initially, denying any knowledge of a payoff or hidden footage. It was only later, he said, after he retained his own attorney and negotiated some assurances, immunity from prosecution for his role likely, that he finally came clean and revealed everything. This admission was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it lent credibility that he eventually told the truth. On the other, it armed the defense with a glaring point of attack that Garcia is a proven liar who only changed his story to save himself. Cross-examination, testing Garcia's credibility. As Eddy Garcia finished his direct testimony, the prosecution's questions ceased and a palpable hush fell. The narrative he wove was as shocking as it was detailed. Now it was the defense's turn to strike back, and Brian Steele wasted no time. Steele rose from his chair, buttoning his dark pinstripe jacket with deliberate calm. He approached the podium facing Garcia and introduced himself. Steele's tone was courteous, but beneath the southern politeness lurked an aggressive intent. The courtroom braced for a sharp cross-examination, a battle of wits and credibility that could undermine the dramatic account the jury had just absorbed. Mr. Garcia, Steele began smoothly, you testified that you weren't initially honest with the police about these events, correct? Yes, sir, Garcia replied, a slight quaver in his voice. In the front row, Janice Combs folded her arms, lips pursed. This was a point the defense would hammer. Steele nodded as if he appreciated the answer. He then launched into a series of questions that came at Garcia from different angles, but all aimed at one thing: painting Garcia as an unreliable opportunist. Steele highlighted, for example, that Garcia had violated his duty as a security officer by agreeing to steal and sell confidential footage. You were willing to break the rules for money back in 2016, Steele pressed, pacing slowly before the jury box. So why should we believe you're not breaking rules now, telling lies, for some benefit from the government? Garcia stiffened at the insinuation. I told the truth when I met with the government, he insisted, but Steele pounced. Only after you hired a lawyer, right? Only after you realized you might be in legal trouble yourself? Garcia had to concede that point. Yes, he only revealed the secret after obtaining legal counsel, and securing a deal, likely a non-prosecution agreement in exchange for testimony. The defense attorney let that sink in, implying Garcia would say whatever the prosecutors wanted now, since they held his fate. Next, Steele focused on the NDA and its terms. He walked Garcia through portions of the non-disclosure agreement, even getting the witness to read aloud a clause that required Garcia to notify Combs' company before speaking to law enforcement about the incident. "Did you do that, Mr. Garcia?" Steele asked, arching an eyebrow. "Did you call Mr. Combs or Bad Boy Entertainment and inform them when the FBI came asking questions?" Garcia admitted he had not. Steele made a show of tisking this violation. "So you didn't even honor the contract you signed, correct?" There was an objection from the prosecution, perhaps arguing that the NDA was part of an illegal transaction and not legally binding, and the judge quickly called both sides to a sidebar to discuss the line of questioning. The jury, however, had already heard enough to gather that Garcia had breached the NDA, albeit in the service of truth and law. The underlying suggestion from Steele was that Garcia's word was fluid and self-serving. Steele also probed whether Garcia was aware of any copies of the video beyond the one he sold. Garcia maintained he believed it was the only copy, and he'd been stunned when a snippet surfaced on CNN in 2024. That grainy leaked clip had reignited public outrage and led Cassie to file a lawsuit now settled. In fact, Garcia testified that it was his old colleague Israel Flores who texted him a screenshot of the video last year. When it hit the news, Garcia, ever fearful, said he deleted those text messages immediately, wanting nothing to do with it. Steele's implication: if Garcia was so quick to delete evidence of his own communications, maybe he was capable of manipulating the story or hiding details even now. Through each question, Steele's demeanor stayed coolly hostile. Polite words pointed core. He emphasized that Garcia had committed a crime by taking a bribe and only later confessed. At one point, Steele fixed Garcia with a steely stare and asked bluntly, "Were you motivated by greed, Mr. Garcia?" The witness flushed. I needed the money, sir, but I also..." Steele cut him off, pressing, $100,000 in a bag can be very persuasive, can it?" The defense attorney's voice oozed skepticism, as if Garcia's entire tale might just be a concoction of someone who happily took a payoff and is now repaying the government with a salacious story. Garcia looked down, struggling to maintain his composure. "It was wrong. I know that now," he said softly. The jurors watched this exchange carefully. One or two frowned at Steele's aggressive tone, but others nodded slightly, recognizing the valid point that Garcia was not a perfect whistleblower. He was complicit initially. Still, the vivid details of the payoff, the money counter, Cassie's FaceTime plea, those elements were hard to simply dismiss as lies. If Garcia invented those, he'd be a fabulous of astonishing imagination, and the defense did not put forth an alternate explanation for, say, why Combs' chief of staff had Garcia's number saved under Eddie My Angel, a detail the prosecution slipped in earlier indicating Combs was extremely grateful to Garcia at the time. Steele did highlight that Garcia never even kept a copy of the NDA or contract for himself, suggesting sloppy behavior or an unreliable memory. Garcia shrugged that off, saying, "They didn't give me a copy, and I didn't want any trace of it." After about an hour of back and forth, Steele concluded his cross-examination, perhaps sensing that dragging it on risked eliciting sympathy for Garcia's predicament. Garcia stepped down, looking drained but relieved. His testimony had been a whirlwind of criminal intrigue, bribery, cover-up, and emotional nuance, the type of story that could tip a trial. As he left the courtroom, jurors' eyes trailed him thoughtfully. The court took a short break. The tension in the room was palpable. Even at recess, conversations buzzed among observers about Garcia's revelations. Was this the turning point of the trial? The prosecution certainly hoped so. They had framed Garcia's account as proof of Combs' pattern of obstruction and bribery, elements directly supporting the racketeering charge. The defense, meanwhile, would undoubtedly later argue to jurors that one rogue payout doesn't equal a criminal empire, and that Garcia's tale was the exception, not the rule, if it was to be believed at all. During the break, Combs remained at the defense table, flanked now by Mark Adnifilo and Nicole Westmoreland, while Steele stepped outside to confer with another team member. Interestingly, Combs had not reacted visibly during Garcia's testimony, no head shakes, no whispering to lawyers. He maintained a poker face. But once the jury was out of the room, those present observed him lean into Agnifilo, speaking in an urgent, low tone. Combs's face was tense. He appeared displeased, perhaps angry at the airing of his dirty laundry. Agnifilo put a reassuring hand on his client's back. Across the aisle, the prosecutors gathered their notes, exchanging looks that seemed to say, "That landed well." They knew Garcia's story, if accepted, powerfully corroborated their narrative of Combs resorting to illicit means to hide wrongdoing. Judge Subramanian soon returned, calling court back into session for the afternoon. The jurors re-entered, still digesting what they'd heard. But day 15 was far from over, and next up was a witness who would shift the tone entirely. Derek Ferguson would bring a steadier, more methodical counterpoint, one that the defense hoped might blunt the damage just done. Derek Ferguson, former chief financial officer, takes the stand. After the lunch recess, with everyone reassembled, Derek Ferguson entered the witness box. In contrast to the earlier fireworks, Ferguson's presence exuded calm professionalism. He is a tall, middle-aged man with a neatly shaven head and a trim salt and pepper goatee. Today, he wore a dark navy suit, crisp white shirt, and burgundy tie, the attire of a corporate executive rather than a typical, sensational trial witness. As he adjusted the microphone, the glint of gold-rimmed glasses caught the overhead lights. Ferguson's demeanor was poised, but those watching closely noticed a certain stiffness in his posture. This was not a man eager to be here. Indeed, Ferguson testified that he was appearing under subpoena, not voluntarily. Having worked closely with Combs for nearly 2 decades, he now found himself in the uncomfortable position of giving evidence in a case against his former boss. Christy Slavic began the direct examination. She had a stack of financial records and emails on the table, signaling that this testimony would delve into the inner workings of Combs' businesses. Slavic first asked Ferguson to recount his background and role. Speaking in a measured baritone, Ferguson detailed his impressive credentials. Ivy League educated, University of Pennsylvania for undergrad, followed by Harvard Business School. He joined Bad Boy Entertainment in 1998. Over the years, he rose to become chief financial officer of Bad Boy and later chief operating officer of Combs' television venture, Revolt Media. In total, he worked for Combs for 19 years through 2017. Slavic drew out that Ferguson was intimately familiar with how Combs' companies were run, the budgets, the spending practices, the hierarchy of Combs' empire. If prosecutors hoped to convince the jury of a pattern of financial impropriety or an organized racket, Ferguson's insights were key. Yet Slavic was careful. She likely knew Ferguson could be a double-edged sword, potentially loyal to Combs and resistant to painting him as a criminal. She proceeded cautiously, asking factual questions about company structure and procedures. Ferguson answered each query precisely, if a bit dryly. Yes, Bad Boy Entertainment started as a record label but diversified over time. Yes, Combs employed many staff, from bodyguards to personal assistants, but Ferguson emphasized these were common in entertainment and part of running a large operation. One chart was displayed showing an organizational diagram of Combs' businesses, which Ferguson confirmed was accurate. The defense team actually smiled at that visual. It suggested a legitimate corporate framework rather than a haphazard gang. Indeed, defense attorney Agnifilo would later use that same chart to assert that Combs was at the helm of a sprawling but lawful enterprise with Harvard-educated executives and departments, not at the center of a gangster-style crew. As Slavic's questioning continued, Ferguson provided an insider's explanation of Combs' financial habits. One notable line of inquiry was about cash transactions. Prosecutors have implied that Combs' affinity for using cash, large amounts of it, could indicate under-the-table dealings or ways to skirt accountability. Ferguson acknowledged that Combs' businesses relied heavily on cash in certain contexts. He clarified that in the music and nightlife world, it wasn't unusual to handle cash. Many club appearances or performances were paid in cash, and Combs sometimes preferred to pay event expenses or bonuses that way. We would go through expense statements each month, figuring out what was business and what was personal, and Ferguson explained. This comment foreshadowed the debate at the heart of the racketeering charge. Did Combs abuse his corporate structures to fund or cover up crimes, or were all expenses legitimate? Ferguson indicated that, to his knowledge, everything was above board. He even said with some pride, "We made sure no one was doing something they weren't supposed to, at least financially speaking." The prosecutors didn't challenge that directly yet, but the undertone of their questioning suggested they wanted to highlight how much cash sloshed around, cash that could, for example, be used to pay off a security guard, as the morning's testimony showed. Indeed, Slavic soon steered Ferguson to a specific set of financial records, an exhibit that would tie into earlier witness accounts. She showed Ferguson a Bad Boy Entertainment bank statement from December 2011 and asked him to interpret a couple of transactions. Ferguson peered at the monitor, adjusting his glasses. He read out what he saw. On December 14th, 2011, a wire transfer of $20,000 was sent out from Bad Boy Entertainment's account to an account under the name of Cassandra Ventura, Cassie. Then, on December 23rd, 2011, just over a week later, an incoming wire of $20,000 arrived from Roderick Ventura, Cassie's father. Another incoming wire for $20,000 was logged on December 27th, though the statement snippet didn't list the sender's name there. The courtroom listened intently. Slavic asked Ferguson if he was aware of the context for these transactions. He replied he wasn't directly involved in those transfers and only knew of them now from the documents. But the prosecution had a narrative to attach. Slavic reminded the jury through her questions, which implied the answers, that Cassie's mother had previously testified in this trial about an incident in late 2011. According to that testimony, Combs had been furious that Cassie, then his on and off girlfriend and a singer signed to his label, was spending time with someone else. In a jealous rage, Combs allegedly threatened that he would release intimate videos of Cassie, sex tapes with other men, sometimes referred to obliquely as leverage he held over her, unless Cassie's family paid him $20,000. Cassie's parents were so alarmed that they scraped together money, reportedly taken out a home equity loan, and sent $20,000 to Combs. Then, interestingly, the money was returned to them shortly after, perhaps when Combs cooled down or realized the folly. The bank records Ferguson authenticated aligned with this story. First, Combs giving Cassie $20,000, perhaps spending on her or a loan, then demanding it back via her parents, then returning it. The extra incoming wire might have been a second parent or Combs giving the money back. It wasn't entirely clear. Ferguson, for his part, did not narrate this. He simply confirmed the dollar amounts and dates. But to the jury, the implication was clear. The financial paper trail quietly corroborated a tale of extortion and intimidation within Combs's personal relationships. It was a subtle but damning piece that bolstered the prosecution's claim of Combs engaging in racketeering acts like extortion, forcing Cassie's family to pay under threat. If Derek Ferguson felt any discomfort about inadvertently supporting the government's case, he largely hid it. He remained collected, though perhaps a bit more terse on these questions. Observers noted that he rarely used Combs' first name or nickname in his answers. It was mostly Mr. Combs or the company, a formal distance that might have been his way of staying impartial. But one telling moment came when Slavic asked Ferguson whether in all his years he had insight into Combs' behind closed doors interactions with girlfriends or staff. Ferguson admitted that his work kept him at the office in New York. Slavic zeroed in. "You worked at Bad Boy's offices, correct?" "Yes, in Manhattan," Ferguson replied. "At any point, were you based out of Mr. Combs' personal homes?" "No." "Did you ever travel with Mr. Combs and stay in hotel rooms with him?" "No, I did not." With this line of questioning, Slavic definitely underscored that Ferguson's vantage point was limited to the corporate side. In other words, he wouldn't necessarily witness threats, violence, or sexual misconduct happening in private jets, hotel suites, or late-night parties. After establishing the key facts and documents through Ferguson, the prosecution wrapped up. There was a sense that Slavic didn't want to push the loyal ex-employee too far in direct examination, lest he grow defensive. Ferguson had answered what was needed, verifying financial records and giving context that the defense's inevitable portrayal of Combs' empire as squeaky clean might not tell the whole story. Now it was Mark Aganifilo's turn to cross-examine, and he approached with a courteous smile. If Steele's cross of Garcia was forceful and confrontational, Agnifilo's cross of Ferguson was more of a friendly chat between former colleagues. After all, Agnifilo's goal was to use Ferguson to reinforce the defense narrative that nothing nefarious was observed within Combs' enterprise. Agnifilo began with softballs. Mr. Ferguson, you and I have met before, haven't we? We spoke about your background earlier. Ferguson acknowledged they had. This reminded jurors that Ferguson had likely been prepped under subpoena, yes, but still spoken to both sides. Agnifilo, an affable demeanor on full display, led Ferguson through a series of carefully phrased questions, almost like a checklist aimed at dismantling the prosecution's theory of a criminal conspiracy. During your 19 years at the company, did you ever see anyone, whether Mr. Combs or those around him, commit crimes to further business interest? No, Ferguson answered firmly. Did you witness anyone acting violently on Mr. Combs' behalf or using threats of violence to make the company more successful? No, I did not, Ferguson repeated. Did you ever see any instances where coercion was used in the company's dealings? That is, forcing someone to do something for Bad Boy or Mr. Combs through threats? Here, Ferguson actually furrowed his brow as if the concept were foreign. I need that clarified, he said. Agnifilo rephrased gently. For example, did anyone ever strong-arm an artist or employee to benefit Mr. Combs or the brand? No. In your experience, did bodyguards or staff try to enhance Mr. Combs' reputation or power through prostitution or any kind of sexual exploitation? Ferguson looked momentarily surprised at the bluntness of the word. Absolutely not. I never saw anything like that, he replied. To the jury, this Q&A felt almost rhythmic, Ferguson's steady negations counterpointing Agnifilo's measured questions. With each no, the defense hammered a tiny nail into the government's narrative. Agnifilo then pivoted to highlight Ferguson's genuine respect for Combs. You have said in the past that you learned a lot from Mr. Combs, correct? He asked. Ferguson nodded. Yes, I've learned a great deal from working with him. He has an incredible work ethic and big goals. Agnifilo smiled, seizing the positive note. Would you say you think highly of Sean Combs, Mr. Ferguson? At this, Ferguson paused. It was the first hint of hesitation. He glanced momentarily at Diddy, who was watching him closely. The room went quiet, awaiting the answer. Ferguson cleared his throat. I have a lot of respect for his business accomplishments, he said carefully. It wasn't the glowing endorsement the defense might have hoped for, but it wasn't damning either. A slight frown flickered on Combs' face. Perhaps he'd expected his old CFO to defend him more vigorously. Ferguson's pause and measured words suggested a man torn between honesty and loyalty. Sensing that lingering too long on personal opinions could backfire, Agnifilo shifted gears to the organizational chart and business practices. He put the big chart of Combs' enterprises back up for the jury. Together, he and Ferguson walked through it, almost like a business presentation. Bad Boy wasn't just some one-man show, was it? Agnifilo asked rhetorically. No, we had many departments, marketing, legal, finance, and Combs hired professionals to run them, Ferguson confirmed. Agnifilo pointed out that two of the top execs, including Ferguson, were Harvard Business School grads. Ferguson agreed, adding that Combs liked to give young executives opportunities, especially from communities he cared about. A faint, proud smile crossed his lips at that memory, echoing something he had told the press in the past. They discussed security personnel as well. It's common in the entertainment industry to employ personal security, correct? Yes, Ferguson agreed. In fact, their job is to protect artists from threats, not to be threats themselves, right? Correct. They're there to keep him safe. This was a pivotal distinction for the defense. Prosecutors claimed Combs' bodyguards were his enforcers, helping commit violence, but Ferguson bolstered the benign interpretation that they were just protective staff. He even noted that, yes, the bodyguards were paid by Combs' company, generally through payroll, further normalizing their role as standard business expense. Agnifilo also touched on how the businesses kept things legal. He asked if Ferguson was aware of any instance where taxes weren't paid or books were cooked. Ferguson shook his head, saying he ensured taxes were filed and above board during his tenure. This flagged for jurors that in the realm of finances, Ferguson's specialty, he perceived no wrongdoing. Throughout this cross-examination, the dynamic was notable. Ferguson was far more at ease responding to Agnifilo than he had been under Slavic's probing. With the defense, he could align his answers with the narrative that made his own career look good. Who wants to admit they were CFO of a criminal ring, and which protected the reputation of someone he once worked closely with? Ferguson's credibility as a buttoned-up executive lent weight to every answer, even as savvy jurors might remember Slavic's point that he wasn't around for the worst alleged incidents. To conclude, Agnifilo circled back to Ferguson's relationship with Combs in recent years. The Fox and other reports had indicated one interesting tidbit. Combs had reached out to Ferguson around September 2024, just as Combs was arrested and this case kicked off. Agnifilo gingerly asked, "When was the last time you communicated with Mr. Combs?" Ferguson replied that Combs had texted him on September 16, 2024, notably the day Combs was arrested on these charges. Combs had wanted to get together, presumably to talk or seek support. "Did you respond?" the attorney asked. Ferguson said he did not meet with Combs. He wasn't in New York and frankly wasn't sure how to handle the situation. The defense didn't dwell on this. It was a somewhat awkward point. One might wonder if Combs was trying to influence Ferguson's potential testimony by contacting him, which could be seen as problematic. However, the fact that Ferguson didn't engage might have spared him from accusations of collusion. Finally, Agnifilo thanked Ferguson. The witness had given the defense exactly what they needed, a credible denial that he ever witnessed any hint of a criminal conspiracy during nearly 20 years of high-level involvement with Combs companies. If the jury believed Ferguson, they might think, how could an enterprise dedicated to crime operate without the CFO even noticing? On the other hand, prosecutors would argue that the CFO wouldn't necessarily notice incidents of assault, pimping, or secret payoffs if those were kept off the books and confined to Combs's private life. In a brief redirect, prosecutor Slavic sees an opportunity to reinforce that very point. She asked just a couple of pointed follow-ups to Ferguson, mostly reiterating what had been covered. "Mr. Ferguson, you mentioned you worked in the office and did not stay at Mr. Combs' home or travel with him, so you wouldn't necessarily know what he did in those private settings, correct?" Ferguson conceded that was true. His knowledge was limited to professional interactions. Slavic also clarified that Ferguson left Combs' employ in 2017, meaning he wasn't around for everything alleged in later years. Some allegations in this trial go into the late 2010s. Ferguson agreed he hadn't been around day to day after 2017. This helped the prosecution subtly show that Ferguson's testimony, while honest from his perspective, might not account for crucial events that happened behind closed doors or after his departure. And with that, Derek Ferguson was excused. Ferguson walked out of the courtroom, his role in this saga complete, at least for now. Clashing narratives and pivotal revelations. As day 15 drew to a close, those in the courtroom were left with two very different depictions of Sean Combs' world. In the span of a single day, the jury heard Eddy Garcia's harrowing tale of violence and secret payoffs, and Derek Ferguson's portrait of a principled, law-abiding business empire. The contrast could not have been more stark, and therein lay the heart of the case. The emotional tension in the courtroom had oscillated throughout the day. Garcia's testimony had everyone on edge. One juror was seen biting her lip as Garcia described Cassie's assault and the hush money exchange. Another juror shook his head in apparent disbelief when the $100,000 bribe was mentioned. The sheer drama of that narrative, complete with a money-counting machine and a fearful plea from Cassie, felt like a scene ripped from a movie. It left an indelible impression. By comparison, Ferguson's session was subdued, yet its implications were profound in a quieter way. His steady voice saying no again and again to questions of criminal conduct served as a counterweight, an implicit suggestion that perhaps the prosecution had spun isolated incidents into a grand conspiracy that those inside the company never saw. However, the discrepancies in accounts were glaring. Ferguson claimed he never saw Combs or his associates engage in threats or violence, Yet the jury had seen with their own eyes via the hotel video shown earlier in the trial Combs violently attacking Cassie. They heard from Garcia that Combs not only committed that violence but then used cash and clout to cover it up. They knew from prior days that Cassie Ventura herself had testified to enduring a long-term abusive relationship with Combs, including disturbing allegations that he forced her into sexual encounters with male prostitutes while he watched the so-called freak-offs that prosecutors argue amount to sex trafficking. Ferguson, in all his credibility, wasn't present for any of that. He didn't attend private parties or late-night studio sessions where some accusers said women were treated as commodities. Ferguson's blind spot to these events was palpable, and the prosecution would surely stress that in closing arguments that a criminal enterprise can still exist even if the CFO doesn't spot the crimes tucked between legitimate business dealings. Moreover, the pivotal moments highlighted on day 15 tied back to earlier evidence, knitting the trial's narrative threads together. For instance, Garcia's testimony about the 2016 hotel assault video corroborated Cassie Ventura's account of that very night. Cassie had told the court how Combs attacked her and that he later apologized, in a manner of speaking, even releasing a public apology video once the footage leaked, which the jury learned about from media coverage. Garcia's story also reinforced what another hotel guard, Israel Flores, had said at the trial's start. Flores testified that immediately after the 2016 incident, Combs tried to hand him a stack of cash to keep quiet, an offer Flores did not accept. Garcia essentially provided the completion of that story. Combs found someone who would accept the money. This pattern of payoffs feeds directly into the obstruction of justice predicate acts in the racketeering count. Likewise, the $20,000 wire transfer saga involving Cassie's father that Ferguson's records confirmed dovetailed with Cassie's mother's emotional testimony from an earlier day. It demonstrated how Combs allegedly leveraged intimate secrets, sex tapes, to extort and control, which is not only morally reprehensible but also potentially illegal. Extortion underpins a racketeering charge. Though Ferguson's tone was dry as chalk when discussing bank statements, to the jury, those numbers on the page told a dramatic story of a family being strong-armed, then reimbursed in an odd financial dance that would never appear suspicious without context. It was only thanks to witnesses like Cassie's mother and Ferguson combined that the jurors got the full picture. A demand quietly recorded in bank logs and a terrified parental compliance behind it. The morning's disruption served as a stark reminder that more victims' tales loomed off stage. Mia, for one, whose identity someone had tried to leak, and another called Jane, slated to testify later in the week. From reports earlier in the trial, jurors knew Mia was a former personal assistant who testified behind screens to protect her identity that Combs had sexually assaulted her multiple times, including a horrific account of him climbing into her bed when she didn't comply with his whims. Such testimony, given under anonymity for safety, was unprecedented and chilling. The fact that someone in Combs' orbit, or perhaps an overzealous fan or blogger, tried to expose her real name hinted at intimidation beyond the courtroom, a continuation of the very fear and power dynamics at issue in this case. Judge Subramanian's vow to crack down on any intimidation signaled how high emotions were running around this trial and how critical these anonymous witnesses were to the government's case. By late afternoon, with Ferguson's testimony concluded, Judge Subramanian called the day's proceedings to an end. The jurors, visibly weary from the onslaught of information, were excused with their usual admonition not to discuss the case or consume any media about it. As they filed out, one couldn't help but wonder what impression dominated their minds. Was it the vivid image of Diddy feeding bills into a money counter to buy silence? Or the calm, confident denial of his longtime CFO that any underworld existed in Combs' realm? The answer to that could well shape their ultimate verdict. Sean Combs stood to leave, allowed by the judge to remain free of handcuffs in the courtroom, but escorted by marshals once the jury was gone. For the first time that day, a flicker of something like fatigue crossed his face. The copper sweater he wore seemed a touch rumpled now. He he glanced back at the now empty witness stand where hours earlier, Eddy Garcia had essentially called him out as a man who will pay big to bury the truth, and then where Derek Ferguson had later defended, in a way, Combs' legacy as a legitimate mogul.